Yeah, it's really lovely to be in this Zoom room and social media space with everyone this evening, and really feeling inspired to hear about the powerful organizing and mutual aid and survival projects that are happening all over, especially there in Western North Carolina and places that are impacted by these extreme, weather events. Earlier this week, I wrote about, what's going on in an article. And I kind of tried to make the point that it's not billionaires that are going to save us, but it's going to be kind of the bruised and battered and impacted that do so. And I quoted William Shakespeare, who in Troilus and Cressida writes, "One touch of nature makes the whole world kin." Hearing about, the mutual aid, the community building that folks have been sharing in this Freedom Church service about bringing all kinds of people together, caring for each other, it does sound like the whole world is kin. But when we kind of pay attention to this like polarized news cycle and everything that's happening around the elections, I think instead we're kind of hearing a tale not of like shared humanity, but really ruin and discord and polarization. So many of the kind of divisive attacks that followed Hurricane Helene, whether it's the lies about immigrant communities getting resources reserved for families and homes impacted by the storms, or the idea that Trump and Musk are somehow saving the day, trying to bring internet access, when actually so often the people that are benefiting from that are more well off. Maybe folks heard like Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about how the government controls the weather. But then some of the stuff that's been most upsetting to me, I think are sometimes backed up by traditional interpretations of the text, for instance, that we heard from Job at the beginning of the service, where we have extremist religious leaders claiming that devastation is God punishing us, maybe punishing LGBTQ plus communities or poor communities or people of color. But I want to suggest that when we hear that passage from Job about kind of God and nature, it's more of a critique from God about how the rich and powerful are abusing creation that's making all of this to happen. I want to suggest that the way we can read a text like Job is as a reminder that God desires the kind of solidarity that we're seeing from Surge and TJ and other grassroots groups on the ground doing the work of creation care, of community care. And I think it connects especially then with that passage from Isaiah 53 that we also read at the beginning of this service. Sometimes it's called the suffering servant. Traditionally, Christians will focus on that verse that says something like, "But he was wounded because of our sins, crushed because of our iniquities. He bore the chastisement that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed." And a lot of times it's about foreshadowing the crucifixion of and redemption through Jesus. It's this kind of focus on salvation that we get through suffering. But I think actually it was kind of serendipitous that the lectionary passage for this week, right in the midst of all of this climate kind of chaos and environmental injustice and also this heroic, beautiful mutual solidarity and mutual aid, is actually what's going on in this passage from Isaiah, that we find redemption, salvation, life-saving in the actions and the agency, whether it's in this poor Jesus from the Roman Empire, or poor prophets throughout the Hebrew scriptures, but mostly in poor and dispossessed people, throughout history, but especially there in Western North Carolina. And that it's not about Jesus suffering as a suffering servant, or anybody suffering and justifying the suffering of people, but actually, and not any place where we're kind of starting to imagine that it's people's fault for suffering or for what's happening around the world or what's happening in the climate, but that here you have stories of folks that are healing themselves and their communities, even though they're sick and suffering. Whether it's the Queer Calvary or these healing centers and all the kind of beautiful ways that people who are being impacted by loss and injustice are healing each other and community. I really believe that Isaiah 53, that story, is one of the strongest passages in the Bible about the kind of moral and political agency of poor people and powerless folks and hurting people. And it's also a strong condemnation of the necessity of that suffering, and instead a suggestion that we can actually do better than this. And so I just feel like as the weather is growing grimmer by the year, as crises are reigning all over around, these kind of examples of mutual aid, of mutual solidarity, are like the most concrete forms of hope. And this kind of scrappy, life-giving action that people are doing, needs not just to be acknowledged and appreciated, not just thoughts and prayers, but actually to be lifted up and scaled up and supported, and seen as the way these projects of survival, these projects of solidarity are the true hope that we have for the future. And I think we see that in communities. And I think it's also been true throughout the ages, as is documented in the scriptures that we read. So it's amazing to be with folks that are living that today. And I thank everybody for it.